Hey there, sleepyheads. Welcome back to the channel. Before we drift into tonight's tale of Ice King's forgotten memories, I'd love to know where in the world are you watching from tonight? And what time is it for you right now? Drop it in the comments below. It's always magical, seeing how far and wide this sleepy little community reaches. All right, lights low, blankets up. Let's begin. Long before he was the strange blue-skinned wizard rambling about princesses and writing songs to no one, Simon Petrikov was just a man. A kind man. A quiet man. Someone with warm eyes behind round spectacles, a gentle voice, and a deep curiosity about the old things in the world. You wouldn't have looked at Simon and thought madness. No, you'd have seen someone who loved stories, who stayed up too late reading by candlelight, and who believed that the past still had secrets worth uncovering. He wasn't from Ooh, not yet. Simon came from a world much like ours before the Mushroom War, scorched it beyond recognition. A time when cities still bustled, and people studied history in cozy libraries lined with wood. That was Simon's world: museums, manuscripts, and mystery. He was an antiquarian, a collector, but not the kind who hoarded. No, Simon believed in preserving things so the world could remember, and perhaps so he himself wouldn't forget. There's something endearing about the idea of a man spending his life searching for relics no one else cared about. In dusty corners under fading maps, in languages that hadn't been spoken in centuries, that's where Simon thrived. He was drawn to the whispers of history, and sometimes history whispered back. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. There's one thing Simon loved more than old books and artifacts. Her name was Betty. She wasn't just his partner in research, but in life. Funny, brilliant, a bit chaotic, she balanced him perfectly. Their love wasn't loud or flashy. It was the kind that filled the quiet spaces. She'd bring him tea while he was deep in a paper about Mesopotamian curses. He'd slip notes into her coat pocket with odd facts like, "Did you know some crowns were made with iron from meteorites?" They were happy in a small and unremarkable way. But those are often the best kinds of happiness, aren't they? Then came the crown. It was unlike anything Simon had ever found. It shimmered with an unnatural cold, even when locked away in climate-controlled storage. The gems embedded in it were not from Earth, at least not his Earth. The moment he put it on, even just for a second, something ancient looked back at him. At first it was just a dream here or there, a cold wind in the corners of his mind, a name he couldn't remember whispering through the static. But Simon, ever the academic, didn't flee. He documented. He kept journals of the strange sensations, the sudden migraines, the voices, the brief gaps in memory. He chalked it up to stress, overwork, maybe a psychological reaction to prolonged isolation during research trips. He didn't tell Betty, not at first. You see, Simon believed he could control it. He thought the crown was a tool, dangerous, yes, but manageable. But the truth was, the crown didn't work like that. It wasn't a relic to be catalogued and contained. It was a living thing, a force. It chose him, and it began to pull. There are entries in Simon's notes that read like the unraveling of a dream. One day he writes about having tea with Betty in the courtyard. The next, he forgets where he left his shoes, only to find them in the freezer. He begins losing hours at a time, then days. His once carefully written journals begin to deteriorate, the handwriting changing, becoming jagged and uneven. Drawings of eyes, of snowflakes, of a woman crying. Still, Simon clings to his normal life. He lectures at universities, still tries to make dinner with Betty, even though he sometimes forgets how to cook. He wakes up in the night, standing outside in the cold with the crown on his head, unsure of how he got there. And Betty notices. She watches the man she loves fade slowly, like a photograph exposed to sunlight. She asks him to get rid of the crown. He agrees, he promises. But each time he tries, it somehow returns to him, always a little closer to his skin, always a little harder to take off. There's something deeply sad about Simon's descent because it's not sudden. It's not one big, dramatic fall. It's slow erosion, memory by memory, kindness giving way to confusion, a gentle man being haunted by something he doesn't understand but he can't let go of. And in the middle of it all is love. Betty stays. She worries, she argues, but she stays until one day she can't. Simon once said that history is full of warnings dressed as stories, but he never expected to become one of them. As the days blurred, so too did Simon's hold on reality. There were still moments, soft, aching moments, where the old Simon peeked through. A quiet laugh at a bad pun. The way he'd adjust his glasses before reading aloud. But these were fading, like distant lights in fog. The crown wasn't just whispering anymore. It was speaking, demanding. He'd begun referring to himself in third person in his notes, sometimes as Simon, sometimes as we, other times simply as the host. And all the while, Betty stayed by his side, holding on to whatever pieces of him she could find. She researched the crown herself, digging through forbidden texts, visiting occultists, even calling in favors from fringe scientists. She begged Simon to let her help, but he was scared. Not just of what he was becoming, but of dragging her into it. One night, in what Simon would later call the last clear memory, they sat together on the floor of their apartment, surrounded by books and candles. Betty was crying quietly, her hand resting on his knee. Simon was staring into space, and for a brief, breathless moment, he looked at her with perfect clarity. "I'm losing myself," he whispered, "and I'm so sorry." Betty didn't say anything. She just held him. The next morning, she was gone. She hadn't left him, not truly. She had traveled, voluntarily torn herself out of time to try and save him. A sacrifice that only someone like Betty Wilde, brilliant, impossibly brave, would make. But to Simon, waking up without her was a fracture he never recovered from. He wandered their home, calling her name, confused and angry, then numb. He searched for her in every mirror, every dream, every echo. But only the crown answered. It's unclear how long Simon lasted after that. Weeks, maybe months. Time was becoming unmoored, stretched thin by grief and madness. His writing shifted from detailed analysis to broken poetry, pages filled with frost patterns, strange symbols, scribbled lullabies. At one point, he believed he could bring Betty back by speaking to the stars. Then one day, there was no more Simon. He didn't die. That would have been easier. Instead, he vanished inside himself. And the Ice King was born. But even then, even in those early days of blue skin and wild rants, there were moments, fleeting flashes, a song lyric that made him pause, the sight of a certain flower, the way a shadow curved across a wall. And for a heartbeat, the sadness in his eyes returned, as if somewhere in the frozen labyrinth of his mind, Simon was still there, watching, waiting, hoping to be remembered. The crown had rewritten him, reshaped him, frozen him in a form that was barely human. And yet memory clung on in the strangest ways, not as knowledge, but as feeling, the desperate ache of loneliness, the habit of singing to himself before bed, a quiet fear of losing the people he loved, even if he could no longer name them. He wandered the wreckage of the world, half king, half shadow. And while others saw a mad sorcerer with a penguin obsession and a thing for princesses, the truth was far sadder. He was a man with no home, a man cursed to live forever without his past, without his love, without himself. And the world moved on. Civilizations rose again from the bones of the old world. Magic spread like mist. New heroes were born. But Simon, or what was left of him, remained trapped in a loop of snow and song and forgotten names. He started writing again. Nonsense, mostly. Diaries filled with lists of princesses, doodles of Marceline's face that he couldn't quite place, and messages like, "Remember Betty," scribbled over and over like a mantra. He wore the crown even when he slept, though no one could say if he ever really slept. The cold never bothered him anymore. But silence did. Silence was where the ghosts lived, where memory tried to return. So he filled his castle with noise, with penguins, with chatter, with birthday parties no one else was invited to. He told himself he was loved, that he was important, that he had a purpose, even if he couldn't remember what it was. And yet, in some dream-deep corner of his being, Simon still whispered, still clung to the edge of the ice, still waited for the day someone might reach in and pull him back out. Simon had always believed that knowledge could save people, but no amount of books, ancient languages, or forgotten scrolls could explain what the crown truly was. Not fully. Its origins lay beyond even his immense understanding, not just alien in the earthly sense, but cosmically foreign. It was as if the crown came from a reality where memory and identity were nothing more than suggestions, and now it was rewriting him. The more he wore it, the more he was rewritten. One day he walked into a university conference dressed as if everything were still normal: suit jacket, bow tie, clipboard in hand. He greeted a colleague he hadn't seen in years, but instead of his name, Simon said something incomprehensible. The room froze. He laughed, confused. Tried again. What came out was snow, cold air, and syllables that didn't belong to any human tongue. His speech was slipping. The crown wasn't just taking his mind, it was changing how he connected to the world. The more Simon tried to hold on to who he was, the more his very language betrayed him. He isolated after that, closed off from everyone, even the people still trying to help. One letter from a former student begged him to get rid of the crown. "Please, Dr. Petrikov," it read. "You're scaring us. You're scaring yourself." But Simon didn't reply. By then, he may not have known how. Instead, he filled notebooks with strange glyphs and muttered lullabies to no one. The notes became more childlike scribbles, drawings of himself with big sad eyes and jagged icicles for hair. Some pages were just blue, entire pages colored in with shaky hands, as if he were trying to drown the paper in winter. Betty's name appeared again, but never in full. B, my B, the one who jumped. Always fragmented, as if even the memory of her was melting away. Eventually his body changed too. His skin turned pale, then bluish. His fingers grew longer. His voice cracked and reformed into something higher, shriller. He started floating, unaware of it most of the time, like gravity no longer applied to someone half frozen in their soul. There's a theory, whispered by magical scholars in the land of O, that Simon didn't fully transform in one moment, that he shed himself piece by piece over many months, like a tree losing leaves in slow motion. And by the end, all that was left was the crown wearing a man like a puppet. But even puppets remember how it feels to be held. The Ice King, as the world came to know him, emerged from the ruins with no backstory, no family, no roots. He introduced himself with flair, with drama, with a booming voice that no one took seriously. "I am the Ice King," he'd declare, cape fluttering, beard frozen stiff. But behind all that bluster was the deep, clawing loneliness of a man who couldn't remember who he was, only that he was supposed to be someone. He made up stories, tales about being royalty and about his right to rule. He claimed princesses were his destiny, that he was a grand romantic hero. But these weren't delusions, they were echoes. Broken interpretations of a lost life. Princesses reminded him of Betty. Royalty made him feel less powerless. The stories were all that remained after identity had melted away. And then there was music. Songs he didn't remember writing poured out of him like dreams. Sad, rambling tunes on an out-of-tune keyboard. Some were about love, some about cold, some about a girl he couldn't name but felt drawn to always. He sang them to Gunther, to the snow, to the moon. He didn't know why, only that singing made the silence hurt less. The crown, strange, cursed, and unspeaking, had tethered Simon to this world. It granted him power, yes, but it also bound him in a prison of forgetfulness. And yet there was something poetic in how it never completely erased him. Just enough to keep him aching, just enough to keep him longing, just enough to let the pain remain. And pain is memory, too. There's a story Ice King used to tell, late at night, when he thought no one was listening. A fairy tale, he called it, about a king who had everything. Love, knowledge, a beautiful home. But he made a wish to protect it all, and that wish turned to ice. He forgot what he loved. He forgot what he was. And every night, he walked the halls of his palace, searching for the warmth he could no longer feel. He would laugh at the end. Silly story, right? Doesn't make any sense. But if you look closely, just for a second his smile would tremble, and his eyes would glisten, not with frost, but with tears. Simon was still there, somewhere deep, like a name on the tip of your tongue, like a dream just out of reach when you wake. And though no one in the world remembered him, he still remembered love. Not clearly, not in words, but in the quiet ache he carried everywhere he went. The ache of something lost. The ache of her. The most haunting thing about Simon's transformation wasn't how dramatic it was. It was how ordinary it felt in the moment. That's the cruelty of slow loss. You don't notice you're changing until the mirror shows someone else. The Ice King didn't crash into the world. He emerged like a frost creeping across a window quietly, gradually, beautifully sad. People who met him in the early days of Oh never asked where he came from. They saw the crown, the robe, the beard, and assumed he had always been this way. A silly, lonely old man obsessed with princesses and penguins, an annoyance at best, a harmless villain at worst. No one questioned why he lived in a frozen castle alone. No one wondered what pain had iced over his past, but the world remembered in fragments. In abandoned ruins, echoes of Simon's life still lingered. Old photographs half burned in the war. Discarded journals filled with cryptic notes and familiar handwriting. A single voicemail saved on a device no one could power anymore. Betty's voice, breaking as she said, "Simon, please come home." Even magic couldn't erase him completely. Somewhere in the folds of time, Simon's story remained stitched into the fabric of the world. Marceline knew that story, at least part of it. A girl who remembered a man with sad eyes and a heart full of songs. He gave her toys when there was nothing else left. He held her hand when bombs shook the sky. He sang her to sleep when fear clung too tightly. To her, he wasn't a mad king. He was Simon. And that, more than anything, is what kept his memory alive, not in his own mind, but in hers. Because memory isn't just what we keep for ourselves. It's what we leave behind in others. Even as Simon's identity froze over, something in him still reached out. He clung to patterns, built routines, Gunther always by his side, breakfast at the same time each day, names repeated over and over, a bedtime story no one else understood, These were not madness, they were instincts, human habits wrapped in snow. It's almost like he was trying to anchor himself, not to power, not to royalty, but to reality. In quiet moments, Ice King would sit by the window of his icy tower, gazing out over the frozen wastelands below. His beard would ripple in the wind. The sky would swirl with soft flakes, and he would hum, no lyrics, just a tune, carried from some forgotten part of his soul. A tune he used to sing to a girl who called him Simon. A tune meant to comfort, to soothe, to survive. And then he'd blink, and the song would stop. "Why am I crying?" he'd ask aloud. No one answered, not even Gunther. He'd rub at his eyes, shake his head, and go back to scribbling in his journal about the latest princess he planned to kidnap. Because the crown wouldn't let him rest too long. Still, Simon's sorrow found a way through. Even in the coldest corners of his mind, his humanity flickered. Like a candle in a blizzard, fragile, flickering, but not extinguished. Years later, long after kingdoms had risen and fallen, that candle would begin to burn brighter. All it would take was a song, a memory, a voice calling him not Ice King, but Simon. But that is a tale for another night. Tonight, we remember the man who came before, the one who loved deeply, studied endlessly, and tried to hold on when the world slipped away. The man who wasn't a king or a villain or a clown, just a man in love, a man afraid, a man who made a mistake. Simon Petrikov didn't set out to become a tragedy. He set out to learn, to understand, to protect, and for a time he did. But the cost was steep, and the forgetting came slow. Even now, deep in the frost-covered heart of O, if you listen closely enough on the stillest, most silent nights, you might hear him. Not the Ice King, but Simon, singing a lullaby to someone he can't name, in a language only the lonely understand. A memory in the snow, a heart under ice, still waiting to be found. Some curses don't arrive with thunder or flame. They settle in quietly, like snow on the windowsill, like a cold that slowly seeps into your bones. For Simon Petrikov, the curse didn't announce itself all at once. It whispered, it waited, it watched. And every time he placed the crown on his head, even for a moment, it took something, a memory, a habit, a word, a piece of Simon. At first it seemed harmless. The crown granted visions. Simon described them in his notes as glorious, unsettling, otherworldly. He saw symbols in the air, maps of stars that didn't belong to the sky. He heard music where there was only silence, and sometimes, when he stood very still, he swore he could feel the earth spinning beneath him. He was fascinated, terrified, but fascinated. And then the visions began to bleed into waking life. Shadows moved when no one else was there. He started muttering words in languages no human had ever spoken. Not consciously. They just slipped out. Betty once caught him humming a lullaby in reverse. When she asked about it, Simon didn't even realize he'd been singing. Still, he wore the crown. Because the deeper truth one Simon couldn't say aloud was that part of him liked the power, the sense of clarity it gave, the way it made ancient riddles feel solvable, even as it unraveled his sense of self. He was slipping, and he knew it, but he also believed he could map the descent, study it, understand it. He thought he could chart the exact border where Simon ended and the crown began. Now, but that line was already long gone. He'd forget what day it was, then what month. He stopped showing up to lectures, canceling on friends, isolating from Betty more and more. He'd begin a sentence and forget what he was saying halfway through. He'd wake up in strange places in the park, on rooftops, in rooms he didn't remember entering. The worst part? Sometimes he felt good in those moments, light, empty, like something else had taken over, something more confident, more free. He started referring to that presence as the ice. Not the crown, not himself, but the thing in between. The ice is clearer than I am, he once wrote in his journal. It knows how to protect me. That's how the curse works. It makes you believe it's helping. The more Simon wore the crown, the more it convinced him that his suffering was worth it, that becoming something other was the price of safety, of power, of legacy. The whispers became louder. They told him Betty was safer this way, that he could protect her better if he gave in. That kings don't fear, kings don't cry, kings endure. He tried to resist. Oh, he tried. There are journal pages stained with tears, scrawled with lines like, "Don't wear it again. Tell Betty the truth. Burn it, throw it in the sea." But those pages were always followed by ones written in different handwriting, in icy calligraphy, words etched deep into the page as if gouged with frost. The crown stays. She doesn't understand. You are stronger now. That was the worst trick of all the merging. There came a time when Simon no longer knew whose thoughts were whose. The voice in his head sounded like his own, but colder, older, crueler. He'd argue with himself out loud. He'd laugh and scream. He'd whisper apologies to Betty when she wasn't there, then curse her name in the next breath. He was breaking, not shattered in one clean snap, but worn down like stone under water. And still, part of him believed he could come back from it. "If I stop now," he wrote once, "maybe there's still enough of me left." But the truth was already there in the mirror. His reflection didn't blink the way he did. It didn't smile when he smiled. Sometimes it moved on its own. And when Betty looked into his eyes, she flinched. Simon noticed, and that hurt more than anything else. He still remembered the exact moment Betty stopped calling him Simon and started calling him you. It was a small thing, a quiet thing, but it meant the world. They were in the apartment, or what remained of it. Books stacked like barricades, blackout curtains drawn tight against the light. Betty had brought soup. She still made soup, even though he barely ate anymore. She set it down, said gently, "You should eat. And not Simon, you should eat. Just you." He didn't comment, but he heard it. And deep inside, it broke something loose. He looked at her, then really looked, and she was exhausted. Not just tired, but drained. She hadn't slept. Her hair was unbrushed. Her hands were shaking. She was watching the man she loved become someone else, and she didn't know how to stop it. Neither did he. "I'm still me," he whispered. And she didn't answer. That silence said everything. The next few days were full of desperate measures. Betty threw herself into the impossible, searching for magical scholars, rituals, even dimensional theory. There's some evidence she visited places that weren't entirely part of their world anymore. Doorways half ajar, broken timelines, rips in the seams of reality. She was trying to outrun the crown, trying to outsmart it. And Simon was trying to hold on until she succeeded. But the crown had other plans. It began erasing not just his memories, but his associations. He would stare at Betty and feel something, a kind of warmth, a familiarity, but he couldn't always place who she was. Sometimes he called her by the wrong name. Once he asked her if she was his sister. Another time, he demanded to know why she was in his house. It wasn't cruelty, it was confusion. And that confusion made Betty cry in secret, hiding her face behind old research notes. He didn't always notice. Sometimes he just hummed and stared out the window, watching the air freeze around his fingertips. That's how it began, the magic manifesting without thought. He could summon blizzards with a blink, freeze objects in his sleep, walk barefoot across ice without feeling cold. At first it startled him. Then it fascinated him. Then it became normal. And then it became him. Simon didn't realize the crown had rewritten his instincts until one winter morning when a pigeon landed on the windowsill, feathers puffed, shivering. He reached out to feed it, the way he always had before. But instead of breadcrumbs, his hand burst with frost. The pigeon turned to ice before it even understood what was happening. Simon stood frozen, staring at what he'd done. He didn't mean to. But the crown didn't care. After that, the apartment wasn't safe anymore. Not for Betty. Not for anyone. The crown's magic was bleeding out of him, changing the air, the light, the very atmosphere of the space they'd once called home. So Betty left. Not forever, not yet. But she said she needed to think, to regroup. And when she stepped out that door, Simon stood at the threshold like a child lost in a dream. He wanted to call after her. He wanted to say, "I'll be okay." But he didn't trust the voice that came out of his mouth anymore. So he just waved. And the door closed. He never saw her again as Simon. The weeks that followed were a blur. He stopped writing in full sentences, began pacing in circles, speaking to people who weren't there. The crown pulsed with cold, not just literal cold, but emotional cold, detachment, numbness, the inability to recognize the weight of what he'd lost. One day, Simon opened a drawer and found a photograph of him and Betty at the museum gala. He didn't recognize himself. He stared at the man in the suit, smiling, alive, whole, and felt nothing. Not regret, not grief. Just the faint sense that something important had happened, and that it was gone now. A snowflake landing on water. Gone before it's even registered. As days blurred into weeks and weeks into years, Simon's journals began to reflect a fractured mind. The entries, once eloquent, insightful, almost poetic, grew chaotic. Some pages were missing, others were scribbled in handwriting that changed mid-sentence. There were whole entries that addressed no one, or strange fragments directed to Gunther or to someone named Betty, but in the voice of someone else entirely. This wasn't just forgetfulness, it was identity erosion. The crown didn't steal memories all at once. It took them in pieces like a thief who didn't want to be noticed. A small name gone here, a moment blurred there. A childhood memory replaced by a vision of glaciers. A lover's face swapped with the shimmer of frost on ancient stone. Imagine waking up and not remembering the warmth of your own name. Imagine speaking in rhymes without meaning to, or laughing when someone cries, because your emotions have been rerouted by an ancient spell. That was Simon Petrikov's reality. And perhaps most tragically of all, he knew it was happening. There are few things more haunting than self-awareness in decline. In the flashbacks we glimpse, Simon often speaks of holding on. He begs himself to resist the crown's call, to remember who he is. But memory is like breath in the cold. It vanishes before you can grasp it. And so we start to see the emergence of the Ice King, not in a single dramatic moment, but in a slow, painful dissolution of Simon, a kind of psychological molting. The man sheds layer after layer of humanity until what remains is a shell, eccentric, obsessive, lonely. He talks to penguins and doesn't remember why he adopted them. He builds towers of ice, not for grandeur, but because they echo something he once studied in a long-forgotten text. He sings lullabies with no knowledge of who they were for, but somehow his heart still aches while he sings them. What makes this transformation especially heartbreaking is that Simon's love for Betty doesn't fully disappear. It distorts. The Ice King still seeks a princess to love, But he no longer remembers why. His desperate desire to capture and marry princesses becomes a twisted echo of the love he once had. A love that was deep, respectful, and mutual becomes a pattern of confusion, of obsession, of seeking affection without understanding its meaning. The crown did not just curse Simon, it cursed every relationship he ever had. Friends couldn't reach him. Betty was lost to time, and any new connection he tried to forge was warped by the manic energy of the crown's magic. And here's a chilling thought. The crown didn't erase Simon because it hated him. It erased him because that's what it was made to do. Its magic was built not for memory, but for power. Ancient, elemental power so vast that a human mind was never meant to contain it. In some versions of the lore, we learn the crown was created by a powerful ice elemental, or perhaps even tied to the cosmic forces that shaped the universe. It didn't adapt to Simon, it consumed him. Not out of malice, but as a side effect of existing. That's why the transformation wasn't instant. The crown is not a hammer, but a glacier, slow, relentless, and irreversible. And yet somehow fragments remained. There are moments, brief and glowing, where Simon resurfaces. He'll say something gentle. He'll hum a tune Betty once loved. He'll suddenly apologize to a stranger with uncharacteristic softness. In these flashes, the man he was flickers like candlelight under a frozen lake. These remnants were not enough to reverse the curse, but they were enough for those who met him to sense the tragedy. Finn, Marceline, even Jake, they all seemed to understand, at some level, that the Ice King wasn't just annoying, he was lost. And maybe that's what makes this tale linger in the heart, not the magic, not the madness, but the quiet devastation of watching someone vanish while still being alive, watching them smile while they forget why they were crying. There's a moment in the episode, I Remember You, that perfectly encapsulates this. When Marceline sings to him and he joins in with a blank smile, he doesn't remember their past, but some part of him still wants to comfort her. Some part of Simon reaches through the ice, and for a heartbeat she sees him. It's a devastating scene, and it's also one of the most beautiful in all of Adventure Time. Because even when the curse has taken almost everything, almost is not everything. There's still a piece that remembers, still a piece that loves, still a piece that aches. And in a world as strange and magical as, maybe, just maybe, that piece is enough. And so as Simon wandered, becoming more a ghost of the man he used to be, the crown didn't just feed on his memories, it replaced them. He no longer remembered why he wore the tattered red robes he now adorned like second skin. He couldn't recall that it once was an elegant, well-tailored coat he wore while teaching ancient Nordic mythologies. He forgot the warmth of sunlight through university windows, the scribbles of student notes, the clinking of teacups in faculty lounges. Instead, the Ice King remembered believed he had always been what he was now, a wizard, a king, a lonely man in a frozen tower, misunderstood by all. The tragedy was not that Simon was fighting the crown's grip. It's that he stopped fighting at all. The world around him moved on. Civilizations rose and fell after the Mushroom War. Magic surged into the earth, transforming it into the land of Boo. But the man now called Ice King remained frozen in both name and soul, endlessly pacing his icy halls, composing broken lullabies on a keyboard made of icicles. He would write songs and forget their purpose, sometimes halfway through a verse. He would draw pictures of a woman's face, Marceline's face, but forget her name, forget why his heart ached when he saw it. In his madness, Ice King wasn't just isolated, he became unknowable, even to himself. Even his voice changed. Gone was the rich, gentle tone of Simon Petrikov, the kind of voice you'd trust to read you a bedtime story. In its place, the shrill, cracked voice of the Ice King rang out like a cartoon echo. It was the voice of someone who had once known love and sorrow, but now only felt the itch of absence. And the people of Uru, understandably, misunderstood him. How could they not? He kidnapped princesses compulsively, but never with malice. It was a ritual of memory, a script he followed not knowing why. Somewhere, deep within, the Ice King believed if he could just find the right princess, he could feel whole again. That maybe she would help him remember. But of course no one could. The crown's magic wasn't cruel in the way of villains twirling their mustaches. It was cruel in the way winter is beautiful and empty. You don't notice what it's taken from you until you're too numb to care. Even Gunther, his loyal waddling companion, may not have been just a random penguin. In his broken mind, Ice King may have been seeking echoes of old relationships, fragments of Simon's past buried under layers of frost and illusion. Gunther might have reminded him of someone, or maybe he just needed someone to talk to, someone who wouldn't leave. There were brief moments, tiny cracks in the permafrost, like the time Marceline visited his ice castle. For a few fleeting minutes, something stirred in him. Recognition danced in his eyes like the last flicker of a candle. He called her princess, but not out of habit. It was different. His tone shifted, softer, wistful, as if a name was on the tip of his tongue, but lost in the blizzard of his thoughts. She sang to him, and as her voice wrapped around him like a memory, you could see it, the ache, the confusion, the almost of recollection. For just a second, the man inside the madness blinked through the frost. But then it was gone. This was the curse of the crown. It didn't turn him evil, it turned him away from himself. That's what made it so terrifying. It was subtle, slow. It didn't rip Simon from the world in an explosion of magic. It melted him like ice on a warm day, until all that was left was a puddle of someone who used to be. He would wake up some nights in a cold sweat, unsure why he was crying. He'd see a child's drawing he didn't remember making, tucked under a pile of snow, and feel a pang in his chest. He'd hum a lullaby to himself and not know it was a song he used to sing to Marceline when she was scared. These were the echoes of Simon. Echoes he didn't understand but still felt. And that's the horror of it, isn't it? That you could forget the people you loved the most and yet still miss them with all your soul. That's what the crown took from him, not just memories, but context. The shape of the pain remained, but the meaning was lost. It's like being haunted by a ghost who looks just like you, but who doesn't recognize you anymore. The deeper the magic burrowed, the more Simon's thoughts became tangled. He couldn't tell what was real and what was story, what was dream and what was spell. Was he truly royalty? Was he always meant to command an army of penguins and rule a kingdom of snow? Or was he just a man who made one mistake and paid for it with his identity? He didn't know anymore, but something in him still ached to know, still reached blindly for a truth long buried. That lingering ache, that last flicker of humanity, would one day lead to more. But that part of the story we'll whisper in a later chapter. For now, we leave Simon Petrikov, now Ice King, wandering the frozen corridors of his own mind. A once kind man, now crowned and cursed, singing to no one, weeping for someone he can't remember. And if you listen closely, you can still hear him humming in the wind. Now that we've traced the slow unraveling of Simon Petrikov's identity, let's step into the silence that followed. A world reshaped by war, haunted by magic, and held together only by the broken hearts of its survivors. Tonight we follow Simon after the end of the world, where memories were scattered like ash, and time moved like a slow, aching dream. So get cozy. Let the blankets hug you a little tighter. We're walking beside a lonely man in a crown through a frozen world that forgot its name. Let's begin. Long after the bombs fell and the old cities turned to dust, Simon Petrikov wandered through the hollow remains of the earth. The mushroom war had ended, but the cost was immeasurable. Civilization had collapsed. Buildings stood like skeletons against gray skies, and roads cracked open like old scars. Simon survived, though many didn't. And the cruel twist was he didn't even remember why. He wasn't yet the full Ice King, not completely. The crown hadn't claimed every piece of him, but what remained was brittle. A man flickering between lucid despair and enchanted madness. There were days when he remembered Marceline's face and felt a crushing ache in his chest. And then there were nights when he danced on rooftops under the moon, singing songs with no words, laughing as if nothing had ever gone wrong. The world around him was changing too. Mutations bloomed like flowers in the soil, and creatures not born of science or nature began to appear. Magic was spreading like an infection, unpredictable and beautiful and terrifying. Simon became a ghost in this new world. He'd pass through villages without a name, sometimes welcomed by the frightened and curious, other times chased off like a monster. His beard grew longer. His robes became patchwork. And the crown never came off. It hummed even when he slept. But deep down, he still looked for something, anything that might bring him back. A cure, a clue, a face he might recognize. Sometimes he whispered Marceline's name into the snow, hoping the wind might carry it to her, hoping she had survived, hoping she still knew who he once was. One of the most haunting things about this era in Simon's life is how little of it he actually remembers. Not because he didn't live it, but because the crown was erasing as fast as he could feel. There's a tale from the hidden forest groves of Ulu, passed down among whispering trees. They say that a being in blue once sat for 3 days beside a dying tree, hands outstretched, melting snow so its roots could drink. It lived. The tree lived. And the man simply smiled and vanished into the wind. That man, they say, wore a crown of madness and sorrow. But his hands were still Simon's. But even with the passage of time and the slow crumbling of civilization around him, Simon Petrikov did not stop moving. His path was aimless, like a ghost drifting through the skeleton of a once-living world. There were no grand quests, no bold missions, only the quiet, aching task of surviving day to day. Each step through the ash-laced ruins brought back flickers of memories, a museum he once lectured at, now overtaken by moss and cracked glass. A subway station, with a shattered map still clinging to the wall, he traced it absently, recalling routes he used to take to get home. But where was home now? That idea had faded. Simon no longer had one. Just scattered shelters, ruined apartments with leaking ceilings, overturned buses, broken bookshops where he'd curl up with tattered pages under the dim light of a failing lantern. It was during these wanderings that the loneliness began to press down on him like fog. The human race had vanished into extinction, or fled underground, or mutated beyond recognition. For long stretches of time, he spoke to no one. The silence wasn't peaceful. It echoed. It gnawed. There were voices, of course, but they weren't real. Whispers at the edge of hearing. Sometimes it was Betty's voice, gentle and warm, calling out to him. He'd turn with hopeful eyes only to find empty streets and crumbling buildings. Sometimes it was harsher, guttural mutterings, cruel giggles, or cryptic phrases in languages he didn't know. That was the crown talking. He knew that deep down. Because now the crown wasn't just a cursed object. It was becoming a presence, a constant companion. It grew louder the longer he wore it, not just in sound but in thought. A tug at the edge of his mind, shaping his feelings, bending his decisions. When he took it off, if only for a few hours, the voices quieted. But the cold would return, biting into his bones. The world outside had grown so bitterly frozen since the sky turned red. The crown kept him alive, in a sense, kept him warm, kept him strong, but at a cost. At first, Simon told himself it was a necessary trade, just until he found shelter, just until he found Betty, just until this nightmare passed. But years went by. The crown's voice became more persuasive, more seductive. It didn't scream anymore. It whispered like a friend. It offered comfort, security, power. And Simon grew tired. There's something that changes in a person when hope becomes habit, when survival becomes the only goal. The crown began to fill the spaces left by joy, by purpose, by love. It told him he was special, that he could be a king, that he could remake the world in his image. He laughed it off at first. A king? Him? He was just a historian, a broken man with a broken heart. But slowly, strangely, the idea stopped sounding so ridiculous. As he wandered, Simon began collecting things, not for utility, but for decoration. Crowns made of bottle caps, a bent scepter he fashioned from an old TV antenna, shimmering fabrics from department stores to wear as robes. He spoke to squirrels and broken mannequins, knighting them in mock ceremonies. These weren't hallucinations, not yet. This was play. Pretend. At least that's what he told himself. And then he met her again. Marceline. Not as a memory this time, but in the flesh. She was a child, barely surviving in the wreckage, alone, dirty, afraid. Something inside Simon cracked open when he saw her. The way she looked up at him with wide, uncertain eyes, he saw his humanity reflected there. He didn't hesitate. He took her in, protected her. Their days together were quiet. They huddled for warmth, told stories to pass the time. He found soup cans and taught her how to ration. He combed through old stores looking for batteries to power a radio that never worked. She asked about the crown once, why he always wore it. He told her it was for fun, that it made him feel brave. But deep down, he knew it was more than that now. The crown had burrowed too far into his thoughts. Taking it off made him feel sick, anxious, incomplete. But around her, he was still Simon. Her laughter, her songs, her tiny hand reaching for his, these became the last tether to his old self. In the shattered world they wandered. The two of them were a flickering light, a little hope nestled in the rubble. But hope doesn't last forever. Oh, but even with the world in shambles and the ice crown whispering endlessly in his mind, some small flickering shard of Simon Petrikov remained, and that shard had remembered how to care. Not in the way it used to, not with clarity or certainty, but in the way a dream might cling to your heart, even as the details slip away. And perhaps that's what guided him when he stumbled across a small girl, alone in the ruins, her eyes wide with fear. Marceline. This moment, this fragile, tender connection, would come to define much of what remained of Simon's humanity, though he no longer remembered his full name or where he came from. Something about the little vampire child stirred his fractured heart. He couldn't remember what it meant to be a father or a friend, but he remembered enough to offer her food, to sing to her, to protect her. The world they wandered together was bleak, trees twisted by mutation, skies hazed with fallout, and strange new beasts that crept through the shadows. It wasn't just a physical landscape that was unfamiliar, it was a psychic one. Time itself had begun to act strangely, and magic, still raw and untamed, was beginning to seep into the cracks of what was once Earth. And through this all, Simon knew, the Ice King was changing. The crown no longer needed to work as hard to twist his mind. His memories were like cracked glass, with whole chunks missing, and others reflecting things that never were. His mind would leap between the past and present with no warning. One moment he was reading a bedtime story to Marceline in the flickering light of an old oil lamp. The next, he was shouting into the wind at people who weren't there. He was becoming a ghost in his own story. But still he stayed with her, even when he began forgetting her name, even when he stopped recognizing his own voice. In one moment of terrible clarity, he wrote her a note, a warning, a last plea. Marceline, I'm sorry. I'm not who I once was. And this is what makes the tragedy so beautiful. Despite the horror of the Mushroom War, despite the weight of the crown and the pull of madness, there was still a core of Simon that refused to let go. He couldn't stop the change, but he could love through it. His gestures, giving her food, wrapping her in his cape, singing that broken lullaby, were echoes of the man he used to be. And in the quiet stretches of wasteland, under broken skies, these tiny acts of love became lifelines. Marceline herself would later speak of this time in fragmented memories, how she didn't understand what was happening to him, only that the man who protected her was slipping away. In her child's mind, she likely didn't even fully grasp the war or the concept of mental decay. But she knew when he forgot things. She knew when his smile seemed hollow. She knew the difference between Simon and the other one. And yet she stayed too. There were no heroes in those days, no candy kingdom, no magic dogs or cosmic owls. Just shattered buildings, mutate forests, and the creeping cold of a new kind of winter. Sometimes they found others equally broken wanderers trying to rebuild some sense of community. But Simon, increasingly erratic, would frighten them away. Other times he'd lash out, convinced they were after the crown. He began drawing strange runes in the dirt, speaking languages that didn't exist. He was changing faster now, his mind not just slipping but unraveling. And all the while, the world around him kept mutating too. Creatures born from science gone wrong, beings shaped by fear and radiation, landscapes that bent in unnatural ways. Magic was not yet understood, but its fingerprints were beginning to appear: glowing lakes, talking stones, whispers in the trees. It was a world that mirrored Simon's internal collapse. As Earth transformed into ooh, so too did Simon transform into the Ice King. And perhaps the most painful irony of all is this: the man who desperately wanted to hold on to his memories was cursed with a power that tore them away. Each time he used the crown to protect Marceline, to shield her from a monster or freeze the cold nights away, it took a little more of him. A trade, a cruel bargain. Save her now, but lose a part of yourself forever. He knew it. Deep down, he always knew. But he made the trade every time. Eventually, the day came when she called him Simon, and he didn't respond. He just blinked, then turned away, distracted by a squirrel in a nearby tree. That was the beginning of the end. From there, the descent became steeper. He began naming the squirrels, dressing them, pretending they were royalty in some imaginary kingdom. He built himself a crude crown out of scrap metal and wire, though the real one always present sat heavier on his brow. He would wander off for days, chasing visions, only to return to Marceline without remembering he had left her. Her heart, though still young, began to break. And then he left for good. Not out of cruelty, not out of abandonment, but because the last of Simon Petrikov no longer knew how to stay. But not every place Simon wandered was abandoned. There were whispers of other survivors, scavengers, even warlords, and strange mutated beings struggling to carve out their own corner in the new wasteland. And Simon, still clinging to fragments of humanity, tried to help where he could, at least at first. There's a particular image that surfaces often when people talk about this era: Simon offering water to a scared child, his face gaunt and tired, eyes ringed with shadows, still wearing the heavy parka that would one day be synonymous with madness. It's not a recorded memory, of course, just a whispered impression, but it speaks to the kind of man he still was beneath the weight of it all. A man trying to do good, even as the magic within him gnawed at his sanity like frost-bitten fingers against warm skin. It wasn't just the loneliness that frayed him, it was the guilt. Every broken city, every flooded subway tunnel, every collapsed bridge was a reminder, not just of the world's loss, but of his own failure. He was a man who had devoted his life to knowledge and preservation, but in the end he had preserved little and lost nearly everything. And now, with every step, his mind slipped further away, memory by memory, like pages torn from a book and tossed into the wind. Sometimes he'd speak aloud to no one, convinced Marceline was still beside him. Other times he would recite old museum plaques under his breath, as if giving a lecture to ghosts. The echoes of his past life followed him like shadows, but they were fading, becoming indistinct shapes that confused and frightened him. Faces blurred. Names became sounds without meaning. His own reflection in icy puddles began to look like someone else entirely. And still the crown was always there. Whispers in the wind that no one else could hear. Songs in languages long dead. Visions of fire and frost and stars dying in the void. He would hear his own voice, distorted and strange, telling him things he didn't understand. At times he would forget that he even wore it. Then a moment later, it would feel impossibly heavy, like a glacier crushing his skull. There were long stretches of time he couldn't account for. He would wake in a ruined house with blood on his hands and no memory of how he got there. He'd find carvings in the walls, glyphs and spirals and runes that felt familiar, though he didn't remember making them. Entire weeks were lost to these fugue states. Time became a slippery, untrustworthy thing. And during one of these lost periods, Marceline vanished from his side. It's never fully clear what caused their separation. Maybe she wandered off in search of food. Maybe Simon, already unstable, pushed her away out of some misguided attempt to protect her. Or maybe it was the Crown asserting more control, driving a wedge between them to isolate him completely. Whatever the case, when Simon next emerged from his mental fog, she was gone. He searched for her. Days, weeks. He called her name into empty forests and snow-covered wastelands. He left signs, drawings, notes etched into walls, desperate scribbles on cardboard and concrete. But there was no answer, just silence. The kind of silence that screams louder than any voice. And something in Simon cracked then. A final fracture in a long, shattering mind. Without Marceline, there was nothing tethering him to the world he had once known. No one to remind him who he used to be. No laughter to ground him. No small, warm hand to hold when the nights grew too cold. He began talking to the Crown directly, calling it "my darling," laughing when it spoke back, though no one else could hear. He created imaginary friends, gave names to birds, to snowflakes, to the echo of his own voice. He would write poems to the cold, sing lullabies to icicles, dance with shadows. This was the birth of Ice King as the world would later know him. But it didn't happen all at once. Even as the madness crept in like frost on glass, there were flashes of Simon. Times when he would sit in a ruined museum and quietly hum a jazz tune from the 1930s. Or when he would find a child's drawing on a wall and break down sobbing, holding it to his chest like a relic. These moments were real, raw, painful, and they remind us he didn't go gently. He fought the decay of his mind for as long as he could. Eventually, he stopped traveling. His body, worn down by years of cold and hunger and magic, needed rest. He began to build things, or more accurately, reshape ruins into twisted replicas of the world remembered. Ice castles, frozen dioramas, rooms filled with mannequins and toys posed as guests at imaginary parties. The world had moved on, but Simon knew Ice King was trapped in a memory he could no longer clearly recall. He no longer wept for Marceline because he could no longer remember why she made him weep. The man who once lectured scholars on ancient texts was now chasing penguins and singing made-up songs. The last human survivor of a broken world had become its frozen fool. Before there was an Ice King, there was Simon. And before Simon forgot everything, he remembered her. Marceline, a small child, lost in a post-apocalyptic world. Not yet a vampire queen. Just a scared, scrappy girl, barely surviving amid the ash and twisted remnants of the Great Mushroom War. And Simon Desperate, unraveling Simon, chose to stay. He didn't have to. He wasn't her father, but some part of him, the part still human, still warm, knew he couldn't leave her alone. In a world where everything had crumbled, he found purpose not in saving the planet, but in protecting one little girl. There's something quietly profound about their bond. Not dramatic, not showy, but deeply human. In those early we glimpse, Simon is already deteriorating. The Crown's influence pulses in his mind like static. He talks to himself, he forgets things, he lashes out. And yet, even in those moments of confusion, he holds her hand, offers her soup, carries her through the wasteland on his back. Marceline's memories, too, are blurry, fogged by time and trauma. But the flickers that remain are filled with warmth. A man reading her stories, singing softly to soothe her, scrawling little drawings in a ruined journal. A tattered plush toy named Hambo, his gift to her, one of the last fragments of her childhood not swallowed by the war. Isn't that the beauty of it? In a world drowning in despair, Simon chose to be kind. He didn't have answers, he didn't have power, but he had heart. But love alone wasn't enough to stop what was coming. The crown, always watching, always whispering, kept pulling at him. Every time he put it on, to defend Marceline or to drive back mutated threats, it took a little more of his memory, a little more of his warmth, a little more of Simon. And yet he chose to wear it anyway. Because what else could he do? He was just a man. A man up against monsters, radiation, hunger, chaos, and a little girl who needed someone to keep the dark at bay. That's what's so heartbreaking. Every time he saved her, he lost a piece of himself. Imagine that kind of sacrifice. It wasn't loud or heroic, no great speeches, no dramatic battles, just small, quiet choices. Choosing to wake up, choosing to carry her, choosing to sing, even when his mind was fraying at the edges. There's a particular moment, quiet and almost hidden in the show, where Simon records a message. It's old and grainy, barely coherent. He says, "I know my mind is changing, but I'm going to hold on to the thought of you. I will always love you, Marceline." And then silence. The kind of silence that aches, that lingers. Because we know what comes next. He forgets. And Marceline? She's left with fragments. A toy. A song. A vague ache when she sees the Ice King, years later, flying through the sky like a cartoon ghost, chasing princesses and babbling nonsense. She doesn't recognize him. Not really. And he doesn't recognize her. Not at all. Yet somewhere, deep in that twisted, magic-addled mind, the Ice King still feels something. That's why he's drawn to her, even when he doesn't know why. That's why she looks at him with pain and pity, not anger. She remembers enough to know that behind that crown was once a man who carried her through the apocalypse. And so the days turned into years, and the world continued to reshape itself into something strange and surreal. Magic began to seep into the cracks of the old world like ink into paper, warping the laws of reality and ushering in creatures and kingdoms that defied logic. Through it all, Simon trudged forward with Marceline clinging to him, his one tether to humanity, even if he didn't know it would be the last. You see, even in his unraveling state, Simon made a conscious choice to keep her safe. He didn't abandon her when it would have been easier. No, he shielded her, comforted her, and sang to her when the nights became too long. It's this fragile, painful tenderness that echoes in so many fans' hearts. He may have been slipping away, but he was still there, at least for her. There's this particularly haunting moment in I Remember You, the episode where Ice King and Marceline share a song. Ice King doesn't understand why Marceline is so emotional around him. He sees her as just another person who doesn't quite get his brilliance. But Marceline remembers everything. She remembers the man who cradled her when the bombs fell. She remembers the lullabies. She remembers the fear in his voice when he knew the crown was beginning to take him. And worst of all, she remembers being forgotten. But in these early post-war days, before that forgetting took full hold, Simon was still there, still fighting. In one scene from the Marcy Simon comic series, we're given glimpses of their travels. They're not easy. Food is scarce. Shelter is hard to come by. But there's something deeply comforting about how Simon always tried to make the best of it for her. He'd tell her stories, even when the crown's whispers grew louder. He'd teach her little things about surviving, about kindness, about staying brave in a world that no longer felt kind. And let's pause for a moment, sleepyheads, and think about that kind of love, the love that knows it's running out of time, the love that tries anyway. Simon knew he couldn't win against the crown. He knew he was becoming someone else, or maybe something else entirely. But he kept going, kept pretending he was still whole for the sake of a child who'd already lost everything. There's a heartbreaking purity to that. No grand declarations, no world-saving heroics, just a man and a child, and the hope that maybe, just maybe, he could hold on long enough to give her a chance. As we drift through the timeline, there's this moment hinted at in flashbacks where Simon finally makes the gut-wrenching decision to leave Marceline behind. Not out of neglect, not out of malice, but because he loved her. The crown's grip was tightening. His thoughts were becoming jumbled. He could no longer trust himself to protect her, to not harm her in some moment of madness. And so, in what might be the saddest, unspoken act of love in the entire Adventure Time canon, he walked away. He didn't even say goodbye. Maybe he couldn't. From that point on, Simon Petrikov, the father figure, the protector, the man began to fade completely. The Ice King started to take his place. Still, traces remained. Echoes. It's why the Ice King kept journals, trying to make sense of the scrambled mess in his mind. Why he hoarded princesses, not from evil intent, but from some misplaced echo of love and companionship. It's why he composed music even when it made no sense. Somewhere deep down in the fractured glacier of his mind, Simon was still trying to connect, to reach out, to remember. And it's in these moments that Marceline's sorrow becomes our own. She doesn't hate him. She never does. How could she? She sees him for what he is. The memory of a man who once saved her life, slowly eroded by something he never asked for. Their bond is unlike anything else in the series. It's not just tragic, it's tender, it's patient. And even though Simon forgot her, she never stopped hoping that one day, maybe her friend would come back, even if just for a moment. Simon's hands trembled, not from fear or cold, but from the burden of choosing what to give up in order to protect what little he had left. He didn't have weapons or magic. He had a child, a tattered backpack, and a mind slowly losing its grip on reality. In those days, Marceline wouldn't have understood why Simon wept when he looked at her. But to him, every time she smiled, it felt like the world had given him another chance, however fleeting. The broken cities they wandered through had no place for children or old scholars. But Simon made space where there was none, transforming burnt-out cars into makeshift beds, building tiny fires from soaked driftwood, keeping monsters away with stories told in trembling, tired voices. And there was always the crown. Even when he didn't wear it, its presence was a weight in his coat pocket, not just physically, mentally, emotionally. It pulsed with a kind of eerie anticipation, as though whispering, "You'll need me soon, and you'll use me again." There were times when Simon succumbed out of desperation. Marceline was too sick, or a beast too vicious, or the night too cold. And each time he placed the crown on his head, something peeled away from his soul, a memory, a phrase, a favorite book. The last time he saw his mother, small, irreplaceable things that fell off like flakes of snow vanishing before they touched the ground. But Marceline, she always remembered. There's a small, bittersweet tragedy in knowing that she watched it happen, this slow erosion of the man who was her rock. She didn't understand the why back then. But she saw it. She saw Simon forget where they were, saw him forget how to boil water. Eventually, she saw him forget her name. Not all at once. The forgetting came in waves. He started calling her the girl more often, then little one. Eventually, there were days he'd refer to her by names that weren't hers. Betty? Abigail? Hannah. Women from his life, lost to time and the crown's cruelty. Marceline tried to laugh it off at first, correcting him gently. But over time, the corrections came with more silence, more sadness, and yet he still protected her. Even when the man was nearly gone and the Ice King had begun to take shape, somewhere deep down, Simon's instinct to protect the girl beside him remained. Inexplicable fits of rage at monsters that threatened her, a strange calmness whenever she cried. There were even lullabies garbled, made-up songs that made no sense, but that lulled her to sleep like warm honey. One such moment quiet, half lost in the dust of memory, Marceline remembered, sitting beside a campfire with Simon humming tunelessly. He was drawing in the dirt with a stick, something incoherent. And then, without looking up, he said, "You're going to be okay, Marcy." She stared, stunned. He hadn't called her that in weeks. Then he smiled, though his eyes were distant. "You're going to grow up strong and weird." "I hope you'll be weird." His voice cracked. Being weird is good. Marceline didn't understand it fully then, but it stayed with her. Those little flickers of Simon, surfacing through the fog of madness, like stars trying to pierce through thick storm clouds, fleeting, painful, beautiful. As the years passed and Simon vanished into the Ice King, those glimmers became rarer, and the memories of their time together dimmed both for him and, sadly, for her. But echoes remain. And echoes, as soft as they are, can be louder than the silence that follows. Years later, when Marceline would hear the Ice King babbling nonsense about princesses and tea parties, part of her would still pause, not because she feared him, but because now and then, in between the ramblings, she'd hear something familiar, a tone, a phrase, a joke Simon used to tell. The crown had buried him, but hadn't destroyed him. Not entirely. There's something powerful in that. The resilience of love, even in madness. Simon was no longer there in body, but the protector, the man who sang lullabies with made-up words, he lingered like a ghost, gently haunting the new Ice King's strange blue existence. But as Ice King's transformation grew deeper and more consuming, the thread that tied him to Marceline began to fray. The once gentle man who told bedtime stories and scavenged cans of soup now babbled to invisible friends and chased butterflies in the snow. And though she didn't understand the nature of magic or madness, Marceline could feel it that Simon was slipping away, like water through fingers. One of the most heartbreaking details that Adventure Time offers comes not from Simon's villainy, but from his forgotten warmth. There are tiny moments where Ice King behaves oddly fatherly towards Marceline without ever consciously realizing why, like a ghost of instinct. He once stumbles upon her singing and pauses, eyes wide and vacant, as if the music tugs at a memory just out of reach. He doesn't say anything, he just listens, and then floats away, confused. It's in these haunting micro-moments that the show gives us its most powerful emotional beats. They reveal how memory isn't just about facts or faces, but about muscle memory of the heart. Somewhere deep down, beneath the layers of icy magic and fractured mind, Simon remembers, not with clarity, but with feeling. He doesn't remember her name or why he feels drawn to her, but he knows she matters. And that aching tug is devastatingly human. We see this most clearly in the episode, I Remember You. where Marceline and Ice King share a song one Simon had written long ago. The lyrics, etched into the margins of a torn, time-worn note, begin to awaken something inside him. As he hums along, lost in the tune, we see the wall between Simon and Ice King ripple, just for a moment. And Marceline, she sings with tears in her eyes, hoping, pleading for just one flicker of recognition. And maybe he does. Maybe in that fragile lull between verses, Simon Petrikov looks out from behind Ice King's weary gaze, just for a breath, and then it's gone. What's so quietly heartbreaking is how often Ice King wants to be liked, to be close to others, especially women, even as he fumbles and ruins every attempt. It's easy to dismiss this as desperation or creepiness, but when placed in context, it becomes tragic. He's chasing something he once had, a connection, love, trust, but with no memory of why it mattered. The ghost of being a protector still lives in him. But now it comes out sideways, tangled, and misunderstood. And through all of this, Marceline remains one of the few people who doesn't push him away. Despite everything, she continues to show him kindness, even if he doesn't know why she does. That kind of forgiveness, that quiet endurance, is part of what makes Marceline such a profoundly human character. She remembers both versions of Simon, the man who protected her and the creature who forgot. In this strange, broken relationship, we see a portrait of love distorted by time and magic. It is not just the tale of a father figure lost to madness, but of a child who refused to let him go. Marceline sings not for the Ice King, but for Simon, hoping that, even if only for a fleeting moment, the sound of her voice might guide him back to her. And sometimes it does. We can't help but wonder, what if the crown had never existed? What life would Simon and Marceline have led? Would she have grown up in a world still filled with ruins, but with him by her side, reading books by firelight, growing old together in survival? Or would something else have taken him away? But this isn't a tale of what if. It's a tale of what endured despite everything, of the fragments of love that survive even when memory fades. Simon may have lost his mind, but something more primal remained: a need to care, a need to protect, a need to feel close to someone, even when the name and face were blurred. Marceline, in turn, kept that love alive, through music, through memory, through tears and forgiveness, and showing up again and again, even when he didn't recognize her. Her presence is proof that what Simon gave her, what he was to her, didn't disappear. It echoed, and that echo helped shape the woman she became. In the soft corners of a ruined world, Simon and Marceline's story is less about loss and more about the persistence of love. Not the grand, romantic kind, but the quiet, enduring love of someone who held your hand when the world fell apart. And in the very heart of that love is something truly unforgettable, even if neither of them can always remember. Imagine a great frozen tower glowing dimly under an aurora-lit sky inside. A man shuffles alone through ancient corridors, clutching a battered book and humming songs no one remembers. For the longest time, the Ice King wasn't aware that he had forgotten anything. His thoughts moved like snow in a storm scattershot, weightless, disconnected. He believed himself to be a noble king, a lonely ruler seeking a queen. And though he was often mocked, even feared, he never questioned the story he had built around himself. But sometimes, just sometimes, reality bled through the fantasy. Take, for instance, his obsessive journal writing. We've seen glimpses of it, crude scribbles, nonsense poetry, frantic entries about princesses and penguins, but hidden among the chaos, like pearls in the slush, were moments that didn't quite fit. Names he didn't remember knowing, places he didn't remember visiting, dreams that didn't feel like his. There's one particularly haunting page where he writes, "I was someone once. I had a name. A girl, red eyes. She gave me soup when the world ended." And then abruptly, the writing spirals into nonsense again. An entire paragraph about teaching penguins to play cello. But that single line, that's Simon, pushing through. The crown never fully erased Simon, it just buried him. And like all buried things, he tried to rise again. Every so often, Ice King would have dreams. Not like the ones we're drifting into tonight, but more vivid. Memories disguised as dreams. In one, he's standing in front of a lecture hall, nervously adjusting his tie. In another, he's cradling a little girl and whispering, "Don't worry, Marcy, I won't let them find us." He always wakes from these dreams with a terrible headache and a strange sadness he can't explain. He never understands why he's crying when he wakes up, only that the tears freeze on his beard before he wipes them away. There's a subtle genius in how the Ice King is portrayed. He's not just comic relief. He's not just a tragic warning. He's memory personified. He's the mind fighting against itself, grasping for meaning in a storm of confusion. And the moments when we catch a glimpse of Simon beneath the Ice King, they're powerful because they're fleeting. Because memory doesn't always return in a straight line. Do you remember the episode I Remember You? Of course you do. It's one of those episodes that sits with you like a lump in the chest. Marceline and Ice King together in a room filled with broken instruments and broken memories. He reads her a song he found in his journal, one he doesn't realize he wrote. One that sings to her heart like a ghost from her past. And she plays along, tears brimming, knowing he doesn't know. It's a quiet tragedy. Not loud, not violent. Just a deep, aching forgetfulness. Even Gunter, the penguin he talks to the most, is likely a subconscious link to his past. Not just a silly sidekick, but a tether. Perhaps Gunter reminds him of something or someone, a pet, a colleague, a life he once had. He doesn't know why he loves Gunter so much, only that he does, in his own garbled way. And then there are the little habits. The tea sets in his freezer. The shelves of old books he never reads but refuses to throw away. The bedtime stories he tells himself aloud, because maybe hearing them helps him remember, or maybe just helps him sleep. There's beauty in that, isn't there? In a mind so broken, still trying to piece itself back together using dreams, music, and odd routines. The echoes of Simon Petrikov may be faint, but they are stubborn. They rattle around in the Ice King's head like wind through an old cathedral. Sometimes, in moments of stillness, he pauses mid-sentence, eyes distant. For just a moment, you can tell Simon is watching through the Ice King's eyes. And yet, even through all the layers of ice, the echoes never quite stopped. There were always moments, fleeting, fragmented, half-dreamed, when Simon Petrikov surfaced again, however briefly, from beneath the Ice King's ramblings. These glimpses were never neat, never full, but they were real, a heartbeat of clarity in a blizzard of confusion. In the episodes we've watched across Adventure Time, Ice King sometimes says things that don't quite fit his usual nonsense. He hums an old lullaby. He whispers the name Betty while staring off into the snow. He seems to sense pain without knowing why. These are the frozen echoes, fragments of a life that refuses to vanish completely. One of the most tender of these moments happens when Marceline sings, "I Remember You," a song woven from Ice King's scribbled notes and her own bittersweet memories. When she plays it for him, something stirs in him. He listens, not just with his ears, but with some deep hidden core that trembles. For a few seconds, he isn't trying to impress a princess or fend off a penguin rebellion. He's still. He's open. And when he sings along, Please forgive me for whatever I do when I don't remember you. We feel the chasm between Simon and Ice King open just a crack, a sliver of light in the dark. These are the parts of Ice King that can't be erased. He might not remember why the song matters. He might not even know who he's singing to. But the feelings remain. That's the thing about deep love. Real heartbreak, it lingers, no matter how much the mind tries to bury it. Sometimes Ice King draws pages and pages of doodles. You'll notice if you look closely that they're not all bananas and mustaches. Some are hauntingly personal. A woman in a lab coat. A little girl with a red sweater, a crown. These fragments are never labeled. He doesn't narrate them. But they're there, floating in the blizzard of his mind. It's almost as though his soul is trying to leave breadcrumbs for itself. A map out of the madness. Then there's Gunter, or rather Orgelorg, or whatever he is or was. Ice King often treats Gunter like a pet, sometimes like a friend, sometimes like something else entirely. But what if Gunter is more than a companion? What if Gunter is also a tether to something real? In the scrambled consciousness of Ice King, Gunter represents routine, attachment, and oddly enough, protection. While he lashes out at others, he rarely turns on Gunter. That little penguin waddles through the fog of his mind like a memory he refuses to lose. The more we think about it, the more we realize Ice King is not purely a figure of madness. He's a person walking through a house with no lights on, bumping into memories he doesn't understand, trying to sing songs he never learned, sketching out people he can't name. And that's heartbreakingly human. Have you ever walked into a room and forgotten why? Opened a drawer and stared at the object inside, unable to recall why it mattered. Now imagine your entire life is that moment forever. That's Simon Petrikov's reality as the Ice King, an unceasing fog, but one where a familiar tune or the curve of a face might still crack the silence. Another haunting echo is how Ice King tries again and again to make friends. It's often played for laughs, but underneath that desperation is something vulnerable. He's reaching out, trying to connect, to be seen, but he doesn't know how. His attempts are warped by the crown's influence, twisted by the magic and isolation. He writes fan fiction, stages elaborate tea parties, kidnaps princesses to hang out. What if all of that every strange ritual is really just his subconscious trying to replicate lost companionship? Maybe in some blurred way he remembers what it was like to sit with Betty and talk about history. Maybe his kidnappings are a garbled echo of inviting a friend for coffee. The mind, when broken, reshapes reality. But the need beneath it, the need is real. And then there are the dreams. There's one moment when Ice King has a dream not of ice, not of crowns, but of fire, of something warm, of holding hands with someone. It fades as he wakes, but in those rare instances, we get a glimpse of the man trying to rise from beneath the snow. It's tragic, really. So much of who Simon was is still inside him. But the crown doesn't just bury, it distorts. It re-records the memories like an old tape, overlaying noise over melody. And so what comes out is Ice King's erratic, often comedic behavior. But behind it is an ancient sadness. And yet, despite the overwhelming force of the crown, there were cracks in its hold, little slips, odd moments, brief flashes that revealed not the man Ice King thought he was, but the man he used to be. These were the echoes, faint, trembling, half-remembered, and they haunted him. One of the clearest examples of this fragile echo was his connection with Marceline. Though he no longer remembered why he cared for her or what they had shared in those dark early days, something in him stirred every time he saw her. he would act strangely more tender than usual, less obsessed with winning her over romantically, and more quiet, reflective, as though something deep in his fractured soul remembered. In the episode, I Remember You, we see one of the most powerful moments in the entire series. Marceline and the Ice King share a song together, one built from Simon's old notes, from before he fully transformed. And as he sings, there's a pause, a catch in his breath. He doesn't understand why the lyrics make him feel so heavy inside, but he sings them anyway. Please forgive me for whatever I do when I don't remember you. It's a line that tears open the entire tragedy of his character, because somewhere in the frozen, delusional corridors of his mind, a part of him is still reaching out, still apologizing for the destruction he never meant to cause, still clinging to the memory of someone he once loved and protected but no longer remembers. These moments of clarity are rare, fleeting, but they shimmer like sunlight on ice, painfully beautiful. Other echoes manifest in the strangest ways, in his obsessive writing scripts, stories, letters to imaginary people. He often reconstructs pieces of the life he once had. He writes about princesses, about adventures, about deep losses and impossible friendships. It's as if storytelling becomes a tool not just for madness, but for memory. Subconsciously, he's trying to reassemble a narrative he no longer has conscious access to. His diaries, as revealed in Evergreen and Holly Jolly Secrets, show a man fraying at the edges, one part lucid, one part desperate, and one part already gone. He records his fear, his confusion, and his worry that the crown is doing something to him, that he's slipping away. And by the time anyone reads those words, Simon is already long lost beneath the frost. Then there are the times Ice King exhibits oddly scholarly behavior. He collects magical artifacts, studies ancient books, tries to understand arcane symbols. These aren't just quirks, they're shadows of the man he used to be. The professor, the researcher. Simon Petrikov may be buried, but sometimes his instincts still surface, like a ghost moving through another's body. There's something tragically poetic about it all. A man whose greatest strength is curiosity became the root of his undoing. And even after his mind fractured, that part of him wouldn't die. It just got scrambled, like a radio tuned to the wrong frequency. But perhaps the most heartbreaking echo of all is how Ice King continues to seek companionship. His relentless pursuit of princesses isn't just a gag, it's a distorted reflection of his deep loneliness. He used to have someone, a fiancée named Betty, a little girl named Marceline, colleagues, students, friends, a life filled with connection. Now all of that is gone. But the need remains. In Betty, we see a crack open wider than ever before. When Betty is pulled through time and reappears, still in love with the man he used to be, something inside Ice King wavers. He doesn't recognize her, not fully, but he responds to her presence with a kind of disoriented affection. He knows she's important. He just doesn't know why. It's moments like these that make him more than just a cartoon villain. They make him deeply human. Someone whose soul hasn't been extinguished, only frozen. Still whispering from beneath the layers of ice, hoping to be remembered. And sometimes, the crown lets him remember just a little. There's a moment in You Forgot Your Floaties, where Betty, now obsessed with curing Simon, tries to enter his mind. What she finds isn't chaos or cruelty, it's Simon, wandering through mental ruins, piecing together fragments of his old identity. His mental landscape is haunting. Halls of broken thoughts, flickering memories, voices echoing through the snow. It suggests that even though Ice King has taken over, Simon still exists somewhere deep inside, sleeping, dreaming, trapped. And if Simon still exists, even as a whisper, then maybe there's hope. Maybe memories don't die, they just get buried. And sometimes, under just the right conditions, they thaw. And then there are the dreams. The odd moments when the Ice King lies in his icy bed, beard tangled, crown askew, and slips into visions that make no sense to him but feel familiar. He might dream of a subway station where a train rumbles past, and he's waiting on the platform with a book clutched to his chest. In that dream, someone might call his name Simon, and though the Ice King doesn't know who that is, his chest tightens, and he starts to cry in his sleep. We see this in small ways during the show. His old notes, jumbled up ramblings written in a language only part of him still understands. His fragmented video diaries where he's talking to himself, or maybe to Betty, or maybe to no one at all. One moment he's lucid, speaking in a quiet, almost frightened tone. The next, he's back to madness, laughing, dancing, chasing princesses. But those brief seconds of clarity, they're windows, echoes. Frozen in time, like fossils trapped in amber, a sliver of Simon still trapped inside. And oh, how the crown teases him. It doesn't just steal memories, it warps them, rewrites them. The Ice King might remember Betty, but maybe she's a bird in his dream or a snowflake he can never catch. Maybe he paints pictures of her, not realizing who she is, only that she makes his heart ache. There's that haunting scene where he plays back an old videotape, one he recorded as Simon, begging future viewers to understand what the crown is doing to him. And as the Ice King watches it, he doesn't recognize the man on the screen, but something in him reacts, something deep. It's not just tragic, it's eerie, like watching a ghost haunted by his own former life. Sometimes he even sings songs that don't seem like his style, soft lullabies, quiet, yearning tunes. He doesn't know where they came from, but they calm him for a while. Even more striking are the times when others remember for him. When Finn or Jake say his name, Simon, it stirs something. He doesn't always understand why, but the name resonates like a bell in a cathedral. In I Remember You, when Marceline sings with him and they read the letters he once wrote her, his eyes grow quiet, almost clear. For a flicker, the Ice King becomes Simon again. It doesn't last, but it's there. These are the moments that remind us memory isn't always linear. Sometimes it returns in smells, in songs, in strange bursts of emotion that don't make sense. And in the Ice King's case, it's like his heart remembers what his mind can't. It aches, but he can't explain why. And perhaps the most beautiful and heartbreaking thing is how he tries to fill those memory gaps himself. In his own distorted, diluted way, he creates narratives, constructs a world of princesses, of heroes and quests, of stories he tells himself over and over because somewhere deep down he knows something is missing. The mind is a powerful thing. It tries to protect us, even when it's damaged. He rewrites his past not because he's selfish or cruel, but because the truth is unbearable. His imagination becomes his refuge. He believes he was always the Ice King, that this is who he's supposed to be. It's safer that way. But every once in a while, when no one is around, he might whisper a name, Betty, or Marceline, or even Simon. And then the silence returns. There's a beautiful irony in how the Ice King, so often dismissed as comic relief, carries within him the deepest, most tragic story in all of Adventure Time. He is a man broken by love, cursed by power, and forgotten by history, even by himself. And yet he survives. Not just physically, but emotionally. In his own way, He's still reaching out, still creating, still trying to make sense of a world that no longer makes sense to him. Every tale he tells, every odd little song he sings, it's a flicker of the man he used to be. Frozen echoes. That's what they are. Hints and shadows, whispers carried through the centuries in a blizzard of madness and magic. And though he may never fully return to the man he once was, the fact that Simon is still there buried, aching alive, is what makes the Ice King's story one of the most haunting and human of them all. And that is the real heartbreak of memory, not just in forgetting, but in remembering just enough to know something is missing. Now let's gently float into the next part of our tale, deeper into the cold, where memory meets magic, and love tries against all odds to find a way back home. The Ice King is a man most people laugh at a wizard with nonsense songs, strange obsessions, and a crown that glows with an eerie blue light. But beneath the humor, beneath the rambling and confusion, is a haunting reality that the man known as Simon is still in there somewhere. He's buried like a flickering ember under the thickest ice. But could that ember ever thaw again? Let's look back a bit. We know that the crown doesn't just cause madness, it rewrites memory, replaces it. It protects its wearer in a twisted sort of way, giving them power while gently erasing the things that once mattered most. At first, Simon tried to fight it, writing letters, notes, recordings, anything to remind himself of who he was. He wanted someone, anyone, to know that he wasn't the man the crown was making him become. But memory is fragile. And over time, even Simon started to forget what he was trying to remember. Yet not all hope was lost. In fleeting moments throughout the Adventure Time series, we see traces of Simon Tiny, beautiful echoes that the crown couldn't quite smother. His love for music, his kindness toward animals, the strange way he always gravitated toward people who were lost or lonely. Even in his worst moments as the Ice King, there's a sweetness to him, a gentleness that leaks out in unexpected ways. It's these moments that hint Simon is still there. And then there's Marceline. She is the heartstring the crown never managed to sever completely. Even when Ice King couldn't remember her name or the songs they used to sing or the way he once cradled her through the burning ruins of the world, something about her still stirred something deep within him. A warmth, a flicker, a note of a melody long forgotten. But this is where the heartbreak deepens. Because even when the pieces were put right in front of him, he couldn't always grasp them. The moments when Marceline tried to reconnect, showing him the past, singing old songs they often left Ice King puzzled, unaware of the meaning behind the ache in his chest, like hearing the echo of a dream you almost remember. So how do you bring someone back from that? Is there even a way? In the world of Ooh, magic is both the problem and the solution. And in Adventure Time, Distant Lands, Obsidian, we see something miraculous. Simon does return. After centuries of madness and displacement, after losing and finding himself again and again, the man is finally freed from the curse of the crown. But it's not as simple as waving a wand. Simon returns, but he's not the same. How could he be? His memories are fragmented. His body feels foreign. The world has passed him by. Everyone he once knew has grown older, changed, or moved on. He's like a man awakened from the deepest sleep imaginable, only to find the world utterly unfamiliar. In that way, the return of Simon is both beautiful and unbearably lonely. Still, there's hope, because even though his identity feels splintered, he's no longer alone. Marceline remembers. Finn and Jake, though, change still care. And in this new, strange chapter of life, Simon begins to ask, who am I now that the crown is gone? What do I do with the quiet that's left behind? And maybe the most honest answer is, he begins again. Not as the Simon who once was, not as the Ice King who stole princesses and wrote strange fan fiction, but as someone new. A man with scars and silence and songs that still need to be sung. A man who is learning slowly to live again without the crown's cold voice whispering in his ear. And that's the faint light in the snow. The proof that even after all the forgetting, after all the madness and magic and missteps, there's still a soft, gentle return. It's not loud, it's not cinematic. It's quiet, like snow falling at dusk. And for Simon, that might be enough. But if you listen closely sometimes, there's a tremble in his voice, a softness beneath the nonsense, a kind word hidden behind a manic laugh. It is almost as if Simon is still there, deep beneath the surface, blinking slowly in the snow. There are rare moments, brief, flickering, when Ice King says something that only Simon would know, like a memory rising uninvited to the surface. In I Remember You, when he calls Marceline by her name without prompting, or when he holds her worn t-shirt with the reverence of a sacred object. He doesn't know why it matters, only that it does. And isn't that how memory works sometimes? Not as a clear picture, but as a feeling, a scent, a shape in the fog. The tragedy of Simon is not just in what he lost, but in what he still remembers, even if he doesn't understand it anymore. Some fans have pointed to these moments as proof that Simon has always been there, buried, muffled, dreaming. That perhaps the crown didn't fully erase him, it just placed him on mute. A soul wrapped in layers of madness, watching the world through the cracked glass. Others argue that what we see are only echoes, fragments of an old identity playing like broken records inside a new one. That Ice King isn't Simon, not really. He's a new being altogether, born from magic, grief, and centuries of solitude. But Adventure Time itself seems to challenge that, because in the episode Holly Jolly's Secrets, when Finn and Jake watched the old VHS tapes Simon recorded, the reaction is gut-wrenching. Ice King sees himself on screen, young, articulate, in love, and his face changes. There's no silly response, no joke, just silence and tears. He doesn't know who that man is, but he feels him. And in that moment, the boundary between Simon and Ice King blurs. It's as if, even for just a heartbeat, the snow lets a little light in. It begs the question, what is identity? If your memories are scrambled, if your voice changes, if your mind fractures, are you still you? For Simon, that's not just a philosophical question. It's his reality. Now, let's talk about the moments when that reality begins to shift. In the later seasons, something unexpected happens. Ice King starts forming relationships again. He connects with characters like Betty, his lost fiancée, now on her own desperate quest, and even finds a strange friendship in characters like Gunter and Turtle Princess. He writes songs. He cares even if his emotions are muddled. And then there's Elements, Come Along With Me, and later Fiona, and Cake stories that explore Ice King's psyche more deeply than ever before. In Come Along With Me, Simon returns fully for the first time. Through a miraculous, heartbreaking sequence, the crown is removed, and Simon stands once again as himself, confused, trembling, alive. It's not a triumphant moment. It's gentle, quiet, as if the universe is holding its breath. Because what does it even mean to return after 1,000 years of being someone else? He looks around a world that moved on without him. Friends grown old, kingdoms changed, and Marceline no longer a little girl he needed to protect, but a powerful, wounded woman who never stopped loving him. Their reunion isn't dramatic, it's tender, full of the weight of everything unsaid. Because Simon can't undo what happened. He can't take back the centuries she spent watching him slip away. But he can stand beside her now and listen and remember. Still, his story doesn't end there. In the Fiona and Cake series, we see Simon struggling with his identity post-Crown. Without magic, he feels empty, ordinary, powerless. There's a grief in losing even the madness. Because at least when he was Ice King, he had a purpose, a shape. Now he's just Simon again, and it's hard. He's haunted by the shadow of what he was. Haunted by the idea that maybe, just maybe, there was comfort in the cold. He searches for meaning, for belonging, and the series gently asks, if you've spent centuries as someone else, can you ever really go back? What's powerful here is that Adventure Time doesn't give us a simple answer. It honors the complexity. It doesn't wrap up Simon's story with a neat bow. Instead, it lets him wander. And that's where we find him now, in a world no longer frozen, trying to live again, trying to be human. And in that quiet search, there's something deeply relatable. And yet, even in the coldest corners of Ice King's fractured identity, there are flickers, moments, so quiet and small that they might be missed entirely if not gently cradled. Glimpses when he hums a lullaby he doesn't remember learning, or when he comforts Gunter with a softness too tender to come from madness. These aren't the acts of a tyrant or even a lunatic. They're the acts of someone who still has something left, however fragile of a heart, that once beat with purpose. The episode. Holly Jolly's Secrets was one of the first cracks in the audience's understanding of who the Ice King really was. For so long, he was comic relief, the erratic and delusional antagonist who kidnapped princesses and talked to penguins. But when Finn and Jake uncovered the tape's fragments of Simon's old recordings, it's as though we're peeling back a mask that was fused to his skin. The fear in his voice, the knowledge that he was losing control. I'm starting to forget things, he says, with a trembling camera in hand. It's heartbreaking because he knew. He knew he was slipping, and worse, he knew he couldn't stop it. This brings us to a core question that has haunted many fans. Is Simon still in there? And if he is he aware? Does some part of him watch silently, unable to act, trapped behind the madness like a ghost in his own body? The metaphor becomes especially potent when we consider how the crown operates, not just altering memory, but overwriting the soul in slow motion. It doesn't obliterate you in an instant. It replaces you, piece by piece, like a winter storm frosting over a window, one pane at a time. And then there's I Remember You, a soft, aching wound of an episode that makes no effort to hide the sadness beneath the silliness. Marceline sings to him, and he somewhere in his tangled, icy mind sings back. It's not a full recovery, not even close. But there's a shimmer in his eyes. He recognizes something. Maybe not the details, maybe not a name, but the feeling, the warmth, the ache. That's memory too, just wearing a different coat. At times, the idea of Simon returning seems impossible. The crown's curse is ancient, deep, and cruel. But Adventure Time always danced between the whimsical and the philosophical. Its greatest gift was showing that healing doesn't need to be sudden or perfect. That change can be slow and messy and still meaningful. In Come Along With Me, we see glimpses of Simon free of the crown, reborn, or perhaps just released. But even then, the damage lingers. He is awkward. He is uncertain. He is not quite who he was. And maybe that's the point. Perhaps the question isn't, can Simon return, but rather, what does returning really mean? Can we ever truly go back to who we were after we've broken apart? Or is healing about building someone new from the pieces we still have, someone who remembers and mourns and grows? For Simon, the answer seems to lie somewhere in the in-between. He can never fully be the man he was before. The past is too far gone, the trauma too deeply rooted. But he also doesn't have to be the Ice King forever. Redemption isn't a straight path, it's a winding trail through snow lit only by the glow of memory and kindness. In Fiona and Cake, we see an older Simon struggling with life after the crown. He is no longer a magical king, no longer a villain, but he's not at peace either. He feels out of place, like someone waking up in a world that moved on without them. There's sadness in his eyes, but also a strange peace. He's no longer consumed. He's confused, yes, and a little lost, but for the first time in centuries, he's truly himself. Still, he dreams. Not of castles and crowns, but of music, of laughter, of Marcy's tiny voice singing off-key in an old shelter. He dreams of what was and what might be again, and through it all, he tries. That, perhaps, is the most powerful thing of all. He tries to live, to connect, to make meaning in a world where he once brought madness. That effort, quiet, imperfect but real, is a kind of magic all its own. But even in the thickest snowstorm, even when the night seems endless sometimes, a single ember can glow long enough to keep the soul warm. And for Simon, that ember would come not from an ancient spell or a powerful relic, but from something quieter, something simple, something human. It came in the form of those around him who never gave up. Marceline, for one, never let her belief in the real Simon die. Even in Ice King's most absurd moments, the rants about princesses, the songs to Gunther, the delusions and spirals, Marceline kept that ember alive. Sometimes she'd see a flicker of the man he used to be in his eyes. A certain phrase, a protective gesture, a tune that sounded hauntingly like the lullabies he once sang to her as a child. These small glimpses were enough to give her hope. And then, there's Betty Groff Simon's fiancée. Her love, quite literally, spanned time and space. Betty made the ultimate sacrifice, diving into chaos and magic, merging herself with Gulb in the hopes of saving Simon. Even though her choice had far-reaching and unintended consequences, it was born of love, unwavering, irrational, enduring love. She gave up her humanity, not unlike Simon once did, but did it to try and restore his. These actions, these sacrifices, these unspoken memories that circled Simon like ghosts, they mattered. They lingered in the air like warm breath on a cold day, invisible but undeniably present. Eventually, when the crown was separated from him, when the Ice King was no more, Simon stood blinking in a world that had aged and changed while he was frozen inside himself. He was a man unstuck in time, wearing a body that felt unfamiliar, surrounded by people who had once known a version of him he could barely recall. Can you imagine that? Waking up after centuries and having to learn who you were from others? The world had moved on. The war was long past. Magic had become common. His field of expertise antiquated. His friends? Most were gone. Betty remained his echo. But even she had transformed into something unknowable. Simon wasn't a blank slate, far from it. He carried the weight of his memories, even if most were jumbled or missing. But he also carried guilt. The things he had done as Ice King, the kidnapping, the nonsense, the damage. They weren't his fault, but they were his legacy. That dichotomy, that uneasy balance between victim and perpetrator, haunted him more than any frozen crown ever could. and yet there was life after the frost. Simon began to reconnect. He tried to find meaning again. He met new people. He explored old passions. He questioned everything. Sometimes the grief and confusion would overwhelm him, sure, but in those moments, he'd look to the people who stayed, the people who believed in him even when he couldn't believe in himself. Like Marceline, who never stopped calling him Simon. Like Finn, who treated him as more than just a mad wizard to be pitied. And even like the land of Oo itself, strange and magical and silly, which, in its own way, accepted him, forgave him. The path to healing was slow, non-linear. Some days Simon felt more like Ice King than himself. Some days the memories were too painful to face. But other days he laughed. Other days he wrote. Other days he remembered something sweet and small like the scent of a book, or the way Betty laughed when she told a joke only she found funny. Those days were precious. So can Simon truly return? That question doesn't have a simple answer. He can't go back to who he was because time, trauma, and transformation don't work like that. The old Simon Petrikov is gone in some ways, but what remains, the man who emerged from the frost, still carries his core, his empathy, his curiosity, his love. And maybe, just maybe, that's enough. Because in the end, Simon doesn't need to be the man he was. He only needs to become the man he chooses to be, now that he's free to choose again. And isn't that the most human thing of all? And now, sleepyheads, that's where we'll end tonight's tale. Thank you for journeying with me through the frozen corridors of Simon Petrikov's long and winding life. From curious scholar to cursed king, to lost wanderer, and maybe, just maybe, to something brighter. If you're still awake, feel free to leave a little in the comments to let me know you made it to the end. And if you're already drifting into dreams, I hope they're filled with snowflakes, stars, and the kind of love that never forgets. Good night wherever you are in the world. Sleep gently. Until next time, stay cozy